Welcome to part 4 of my series on how to overcome depression. If you haven't seen part 1 to 3, I do recommend that before watching this video. This video will focus on a powerful CBT technique called Trap and Track, which is designed to help us fight back against depression. If you've watched part 1 to 3, you should have a good understanding of how we fall into avoidance patterns when we feel depressed. We often try to avoid any negative feelings or thoughts by suppressing them, using distraction, or things such as TV or excessive gaming, or by the use of alcohol or drugs. We may also fall into avoidance because nothing feels pleasurable anymore, or we lack motivation or feel tired. Or we avoid to stop a feared outcome from happening by completely avoiding situations, people, or activities. Or we can avoid by overcompensating to prevent our fear from happening, such as people pleasing, clinging to loved ones, or trying to never make a mistake. As we've discussed previously, this avoidance is doomed to fail because it only works in the short term, but what it does in the long term is disrupts our rewards and increases our stressors. So what do we need to do about this? In our previous videos, we looked about increasing our activity levels by engaging in valued activities. However, this can sometimes be hard and depression fights back. That's because these avoidance patterns are hard to break out of. This is where Trap and Track comes in. Trap and Track is a strategy designed to help us make the right choice when we feel like giving in to avoidance. Trap and Track is an acronym. The first part, TRAP, stands for Trigger, Response and Avoidance Pattern. This tool is designed to help us analyse the short-term and long-term consequences for using an avoidance pattern. Let's break this down. First, we need to examine the trigger causing us to want to avoid in the first place. This could be issues with work, friends, family, or even something we've done, such as another avoidance pattern or dwelling on something. We then need to analyse our response to this trigger. This is not how we respond in terms of action, but how we emotionally respond to the trigger. Does the trigger make us sad, frustrated, angry, anxious, ashamed, guilty, and so on? Once we know how we are feeling, we need to consider what avoidance pattern we are about to use. Are you tempted to avoid an activity or person? Numb yourself with a substance? This can even include binging on chocolates or foods. Distract yourself with low-valued activities such as binge watching for hours or doom scrolling on social media. Are you tempted to try to overcompensate and try to prevent a fear from occurring? Or procrastinate what needs to be done? The last step is to consider what is the short-term and long-term consequences and advantages of doing this. Often avoidance patterns feel attractive in the short term. That's why we do them. They're usually the path of least effort. However, in the long term, very little changes when we use them. An example of a trap. So the trigger might be someone whose friends have invited them to a party. They responded with a sense of dread because they didn't feel like they had the energy to go and they worried others won't enjoy their company. So there's an avoidance pattern. They were tempted to cancel at the last moment with an excuse. When they examined their short-term consequences, they realised they would get a sense of relief by not having to go to the party and that they get a free evening to themselves. However, in the long term, they realised it's not the first time they've cancelled on their friends, and their friends may start to notice or even get annoyed. They might miss out on the potential of a good time, and they're most likely going to feel more depressed in the long term. Now that's the trap of avoidance patterns. The second half is to get you back on track. TRACK stands for Trigger, Response, Alternative Coping. The trigger and response is the same as before. However, the last part gets you to consider a healthier, more long-term alternative to your avoidance pattern. This part is about replacing avoidance with something that brings your life value or helps your situation. Consider, what could you do that is more helpful than your avoidance pattern in the long term? How can I act in a way that is in line with my values? What would increase my well-being? How would I act if I was not feeling depressed? Once you've selected an option, then we can examine the short-term and long-term consequences again. Often alternative coping is harder in the short term, but better in the long term. For example, when we are low and tired, it is much easier to put off going to your fitness class and watch TV. So in the short term, watching TV might have the advantage, as it is less effort. However, exploring the alternative coping strategy shines in the long term. Going to that fitness class might boost your mood, give you social interactions, your fitness improves, and so on. When looking at these long-term consequences, consider what impact both the avoidance pattern and the alternative coping would have on the stresses in your life and the level of reward you're getting. Let's look at the previous example on how an alternative coping works. The trigger and the response remains the same, but the alternative coping is they decide they should go to the party regardless of how they're feeling. When they look at the short-term consequences, they do realise it might take more energy to go to the party. They might feel more anxious and be more tired, but there is a chance it might be fun. When they look at the long-term consequences, they realise their friends will like them more if they go to the party. They might feel better for it, and they'll probably be less depressed in the long run. Trap and track is to give you a conscious choice over your actions rather than letting the depression decide for you. At this point, you can clearly see the short-term versus long-term consequences of both your avoidance patterns and your alternative coping. So it's up to you to select the option that gives your life more value. Do trap and track on paper until you get into the swing of it. I don't recommend doing it all in your head at first. The depression will most likely win and convince you to use your avoidance pattern. Trap and track is just like any other skill. You need to practice it regularly for it to become effective. Each time you use it to effectively overcome your avoidance patterns, your life becomes a little bit better in the long term, giving you more rewards and helping you overcome your stresses. Over time, this counteracts the cause of your depression. For more information, have a look at my CBT self-help guide, which includes worksheets and a step-by-step approach to overcoming depression.